I want to look to history. I want to start with a call to history at this moment. I was thinking today is May Day, and what has been said on previous May Days. And who better to say it than Eugene Victor Debs, who said 90 years ago today, "Ever since men and women of moral courage have dared to speak the truth as they saw the truth, they have been maligned and persecuted. Remember that Jefferson was said to be a violent fanatic. Samuel Adams was a dangerous character. Patrick Henry was called an incendiary," and I'll just note he was. "But the cause which they championed, it triumphed, and their names today are revered. A little later, there was a group of abolitionists who fought against the institution of slavery, which had existed in this country for 250 years. Abolitionism struck at the root of an evil thing, instead of compromising with it on the ground that the time is not right. Those men were ridiculed, denounced, imprisoned, and killed, but today they are honored, while their persecutors are forgotten and their very memories are reviled. And shall we fear to be ashamed to join this company? On this May Day, let us stand upright and be counted. We need to be united. We need to get together. We need to feel the common touch. The world will always be against us if we are not for ourselves." That's the spirit in which we come together here today. There's a simple truth in Debs' words. The world will always be against us if we're not for ourselves. Act like a loser and you'll lose. You will lose. If you act like a winner, you may win. Progressives have been acting like reactionaries for most of my lifetime. We've been acting like losers. We've been acting like a minority. And the simple truth is that we're a majority on the issues that really matter. On almost every major issue of the day, you're talking about war and empire, the economy, you're talking about voting rights, whether you're talking about health care. The reality is that the American people are with us on most of the important issues of the day. We can win. My argument today is to suggest that in order to win, we must build a democracy movement. And I think it's telling that the United States of America are home to every kind of movement under the sun. We have a labor movement, a gay rights movement, a women's movement, an environmental movement, an animal rights movement, and on and on and on, but not a democracy movement. Why is that? What's been going on? What have progressives been doing? We've been challenging on every front but one, the struggle for power. Think on that. I would suggest to you that if you believe that democracy, ruled by the people, is a necessary thing, a good thing, as any movement that intends to win must believe. You must believe that the rule of the people will be a good thing. Then you need a democracy movement. You don't get democracy without struggling for it. And I'll share with you just some of the advantages that I see in building a movement for democracy. First of all, democracy is deeply rooted in this country. It is a deeply positive part of the American tradition. When the Sons of Liberty gathered in Boston, and there are some fellow Bostonians here, I count myself among them because that's where my family comes from, although I'm a Wisconsinite. I can claim more than one. But when they gathered in Boston and they raised the Liberty Tree flag, on the Liberty Tree flag it said, "The voice of the people is the voice of God." Think of that. Not only were they saying that we are going to challenge the greatest sovereign power that the world had yet known, greater than Rome, that they were going to put the people in the place of the sovereign and take out the monarchy, but that the people themselves, the voice of the people was the voice of God. They're putting the people in the place of God. What a radical concept. And there are so many generations that have carried forward with that ideal, a generation after generation. The reason why Wisconsin is a progressive state, in fact, is because their children and grandchildren moved here. They settled here. We originally had some Southerners here, and I love people from the South. And Kevin's not here, but you know, I do love them dearly. But the reality is, if the Virginians had stayed and the Yankees had not come, this would be a different state, and we would not be having this conference here today. So there is a deep tradition that is carried on generation after generation within families, within movements. The torch has been passed down, and democracy is an indigenous thing to this country. And we should stand on that, because after all, we are the majority. That's right. We are the majority, right? Yes, I see the voices, I hear the voices, I see the heads. I'll also suggest that one of the great things about building a democracy movement is that democracy is subversive everywhere. In every country, on every terrain, on every issue, democracy is a subversive thing. It's a radical thing. It gets to the root. And so there's no end to struggling for democracy. It's not like other campaigns where you win your particular struggle and then you pack up your bags and go home. It leads to other things. I would also suggest that an advantage is that campaigning for democracy helps us in other areas. If you're dealing with a powerful figure and you want some material demand met, you're looking for a wage increase, you're looking for an increase in benefits, and you not only make the demand to them, but you go after their power. You say that we challenge your right to make these decisions. We don't just challenge your decisions, we challenge the very basis under which you make these decisions. It becomes to their advantage to give you what you're asking for in that other field. And I've seen that happen time and time again. They tried to buy us off. They don't want to talk about power. They don't want to talk about democratization. So they'll give you your tuition freeze if you're a university student. They'll divest from Burma. They'll give you the more short-term reforms. And then finally, I would say, in terms of an advantage, and I'll share this with you because I know that you're advocates, but I want to sort of arm us for going out and talking with other progressives as well, that winning democracy means winning nearly all of our demands. Just think of it. You win a particular campaign, a particular struggle, and we kicked Exxon out of Wisconsin. We took on one of the largest multinational corporations in the world, if not the largest at that time. Incredible movement, incredible diversity, incredible tactics. We won. We banned metallic sulfide mining in Wisconsin. There is no Exxon mine next to the Mole Lake Secaucus Chippewa Reservation. But you know what? After that, it was over. It was over, and there were other fronts in which we lost while we were engaged in that struggle. So there's a lot of good reasons, very solid reasons for progressives to wake up and to begin to struggle for power, not just for a larger slice of the pie or for more of the desserts. I want to also get down to practicalities here. Kevin and Diane and I were talking a little bit, and he said, let's get concrete, let's get detailed. So that's what I'm going to do with the remainder of my time. First of all, what does a democracy movement look like? Well, first of all, and we're going to have some discussion about this, but first of all, I would suggest to you that it's made up of actual campaigns, of pro-democracy campaigns. It's not a matter of 10 million people going out into the streets one day and then suddenly we have democracy. There's a democratic revolution. Later tonight, we're going to be looking back at Seattle, in the protests in Seattle, and also here, the Mifflin here in Madison. People think that suddenly 50,000 trade unionist students, peasants got together in Seattle and shut down the WTO. That's not what happened. It took a whole series of campaigns that were going on throughout the 1990s that many of us were involved with to get to that point. Same is true of building a democracy movement. We have to build campaigns in different areas of society. Secondly, I would suggest that a democracy movement has as its ultimate goal a new constitution. It has a constitutional agenda. It is about changing the basic ground rules. And again, this is as was originally intended. Thomas Jefferson said that he expected there would be constitutional conventions every 30 years. Well, I would suggest that we are maybe 180 years late on that guarantee, on that expectation. And then finally, a democracy movement is neither single issue nor multi-issue, but rather every issue. It's different. It's qualitatively different from every other kind of movement that we might imagine or we might get engaged in. So I mentioned earlier that it's made up of pro-democracy campaigns. Well, what do these look like? It's not so difficult. Some of this work is going on right now. Pro-democracy campaigns are afoot in every area of society. For example, in Ohio, when students started out this past year fighting against tuition hikes and for access to education, they soon figured out pretty quick, much faster than many people, they figured out that the people who were making the decisions were their board of trustees. And they said, if we want to change the way that education is financed, we need to change power. And now they're pushing for election of the board of trustees, the University of Ohio. And we see campaigns like that going on campuses all across the country today. Student occupations that are not on the front page of the New York Times, but have been happening this past year, a real resurgence in terms of campus democracy campaigns. That's right. And it's inspiring to me because some of us have done that work. Diane and I worked together 14 years ago on this campus on some of those campaigns, and it's going somewhere. So you can see it in education. You can see it in terms of this movement that's afoot now in 25 states to democratize defense. When we talk about bringing the National Guard home, that's just the beginning. We have legislation that's been introduced now in 12 states that says that the National Guard, the state National Guard, may not be called into national service unless there's some lawful basis for it. Because what's happened to our National Guard, which was our original system of defense, it was made up of the people themselves, is that it has been made into a reserve for imperialism. So what is now happening is people are saying we're going to restore a more democratic order in terms of the way in which America pretends and tries to defend herself, right? So that's a campaign to democratize defense. I would suggest that there are all these voting rights groups made up of regular people all across the country that are engaged not only in fighting for passage of election reform legislation through Congress, but also in their local communities. Meetings earlier this week where people are working to address problems that they're seeing at the local level with ballot shortages and problems with machines. We have Bev Spear here from the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. I mean, these are real pro-democracy campaigns. We have an exciting effort that's underway to make budgeting more democratic with participatory budgeting. And it's been a number of years that there have been a number of us around the U.S. who have been saying, they really figured something out well in Latin America. They figured out that when you have a budget shortage, the way to deal with the problem is to ask the people, to give the people control over the budget decisions. That's what they started in Porto Alegre. It's spread all around the world. And now finally, in Chicago is going to be the first major city in the United States to have a participatory budgeting program. So I guess, I could go on and on. We could talk about religion. We could talk about the family. We could talk about the legal system itself. But there are ways to articulate and advance democratic demands in every area of life. And when you put those together, when you build these specific pro-democracy campaigns, when you centralize democracy in your work, not just democratic process internally, but democratic demands, democratic goals. That's how you start to build a democracy movement in the United States. In terms of how we get there, I guess there's one other thing I would say. I think we have to recognize that even as these pro-democracy campaigns have advanced, and I have some experience with this, trying this out in different areas, what we found is that over time, there's a tendency for a lot of people to ramp down, okay, to step back from the struggle of power and to turn instead in favor of petitioning those in power, right? And the reason for that, I think, is, first of all, it's scary to imagine being responsible for society. It's scary to go up against people who have guns, right? When I talked about democratizing education, we had a very successful campaign that went on over 7 years on this campus. That's where I met my wife, who's sitting in the audience. She was one of 54 people who were arrested for occupying Bascom Hall here, right? So that's a reality. It's not easy. It's not safe. And then finally, I think there is a victim mentality, as I started off saying, on the left, among progressives. This sense that we will always be marginal even though we're the majority, that we are the minority even though we're the majority, that we can't trust the people even though we really can trust the people. And what I would say is, I really don't want a piece of the pie. I want power. If I have power, I can make all the pie I want. And personally, I really like apple pie. And I'll wrap with this. I'll say, don't just listen to me telling you that this is so. Listen to the words of Fighting Bob La Follette, speaking on another revolutionary holiday, July 4th, speaking in 1897 in Mineral Point down the road. He said, "Since the birth of the Republic, indeed almost within the last generation, a new and powerful factor has taken its place in our business, financial, and political world, and is there exercising a tremendous influence. The corporation of today has invaded every department of business, and its powerful but invisible hand is felt in almost all activities of life. The effect of this change upon the American people is radical and rapid. God, how patient are thy poor? These corporations and masters of manipulation and finance, heaping up great fortunes by a system of legalized extortion, and then exacting from the contributors, to whom a little means so much, a double share to guard their treasure. When legislatures will boldly repudiate their constituents and violate the pledges of their platforms, then indeed have the servants become the masters, and the people ceased to be sovereign. Gone the government of equal rights and equal responsibilities, lost the jewel of constitutional liberty. Do not look to such lawmakers to restrain corporations within proper limits. Do not look to such lawmakers to equalize the burden of taxation. Do not look to such lawmakers to lift politics out of the ways of darkness. Those were his words over 100 years ago. And I think that if Fighting Bob were with us here today, he would add, do not look to those lawmakers. Look to yourselves. Become again lawmakers. Build the democracy movement. Build the American Revolution. Those are my words to you today.
We're a watchdog group. We focus on organized campaigns to shape media coverage, be it government propaganda or corporate spin. And we're an organization that was founded back in 1993 by John Stauber, who was being spied on by Monsanto's PR people and realized that in order for grassroots democratic movements to have victories, that there needed to be a constant watchdogging of the one of many ways in which corporations and governments thwart democracy, which is to thwart the information that we get and whether or not we're able to share accurate information with each other. I think it is in a way intuitive that you can't have a good, vibrant democracy without good information, and that includes a very strong ongoing educational system, but also, I think, a very vital and democracy-supporting news media system. And unfortunately, we're in a position now where this can be quantified, how much we need our news media now that it's disappearing. There was just a study that came out from Princeton University researchers. They looked before and after the 2007 closing of the Cincinnati Post. They looked at nearly 30 different local communities where this had been the main source of information for people on local events, and they said, well, you know, how does voter turnout compare before and after this paper closed? How does the number of candidates running for office, how does that compare? And also, how does the incumbency advantage, how likely is it that whoever's in office is going to stay in office? How does that compare? And they all went significantly down. They all went in the way that we don't want them to go. And they were shocked, actually, how much it went down, even though it was a small sample. And they said, you know, this really proves that access to meaningful, good local reporting does have an impact on whether or not we're able to participate in our local democracies. So when you talk about media and democracy, I think we all know that there are two different visions of how that works and how it should work. And one is the one that I'm going to assume we all share, I think pretty safely assume, and that is that we should have a news media system that informs and empowers and connects people and communities, that reflects the values and the interests and the diversity of those communities, that takes grassroots citizen movements seriously, that helps people become involved by letting you know information on what's going on and ways to connect and organize around the issues that are important to you. And I think it's really important to notice that this is a human right, that having good media is actually a human right. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 19 of that document says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. So this sounds really good, then what does that mean? And there's been an interesting sort of international grassroots movement that has said, well, we're going to run with this, and we're going to see, you know, how do we apply this to everyday life and diversity of communities around the world? And they came up with a communication rights movement and a mission statement a mission statement that says, first of all, we can't even talk about freedom of expression until we talk about and address, and I'm quoting, the dominance of powerful voices, the hugely varying levels of access to power and to the means of communication in society, especially mass media. And so they go on to say, well, what do we need to do? Well, we need to break down barriers, put in place enabling mechanisms, and enhance self-determination. And that way, communication rights builds an environment in which people are better equipped to receive messages, to understand and respond to them, and to communicate critically, competently, and creatively. Communication rights nurtures an environment of tolerance and mutual respect in the context of communication. So I think communication rights can be powerful in terms of, it's not just, well, this should be better, we shouldn't have been lied into war in Iraq. It's, no, this is a basic right of communication. And this is, after all, especially with broadcast media, we're talking about our airwaves and what's being done with them and who's being allowed to profit off of them without serving the public interest, without supporting democracy. So that's one vision of media and democracy. Then there's the other vision, and which is unfortunately all too often the reality in our system, and that's a corporate beholden mass media system that treats citizens like observers. You don't need to know what's happening, just sit there and be an eyeball that can be sold to advertisers, or be pairs of ears that can be sold to advertisers, or what have you. Ignores the existence of grassroots movements and just serves to repeat whatever propaganda is being put out there, be it by corporations that are rushing to serve the bottom line and ignoring human rights, labor rights, the environment, whatever it is, or government power, and not serving as any check on that. At the same time, we have, of course, very good independent media like WORT, but which suffers from a lack of resources and definitely has a limited reach in terms of audience. So this is a system that obviously benefits people in power, and it's very consciously maintained and very consciously manipulated in a way to maintain that power and to limit that access to media, even in the information age in which we live. So, I think it's really informative, interesting, to look at some of the early practitioners of public relations, some of the people who, coming out of the World War I propaganda effort in the US, who said, well, what we need to do, we'll have a free media, we'll have a democracy, but we need to propagandize. We need to change what people think. We need to not say, you should buy this. We need to make you feel that you need this. We need to make you agree before you even think about this. And so you have Ed Bernays, who's probably the most famous, early thinker and practitioner in public relations. He called himself a propagandist, and he said, quoting from his 1928 book, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. No serious sociologist any longer believes that the voice of the people expresses any divine or specially wise and lofty idea. Fortunately, the sincere and gifted politician is able, by the instrument of propaganda, to mold and form the will of the people." So he's very happy with that because he sees himself along with the elites. Walter Lippmann is another famous early PR practitioner and saw himself as a very good liberal, actually. He was a newspaper columnist. He was also part of the World War I propaganda effort. And he thought a lot about democracy, and he came to the conclusion that it doesn't work, that you can't trust the masses with the power to make decisions. And so, his solution to this was, we need to have people who know better, this elite class, sort of controlling everything. And that's why he went into PR. And just a quote from him, he actually coined the phrase, the manufacture of consent. That wasn't something that Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman came up with. They were pointing to him. But he said, the idea of enlightened self-government is, quote, a democratic fallacy. The practice of democracy has turned a corner, and persuasion has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. So you have this side that unfortunately has dominated, and I'm quoting these people from the 1920s when the Progressive was just a teenager, but I'm quoting them because they were very honest about what they were doing, and they thought what they were doing was what needed to be done. Unfortunately, we have much more effective spinners nowadays, but they're much less honest about what they do at the same time. So, we know in our work, in our campaigns, that these are the forces we're up against, that these are the forces that have the resources, that have the power, that can afford the multi-million-dollar PR contracts, and PR in marketing is multi-billion-dollar industry just in the U.S. alone. These are the people that set up corporate front groups to take the mantle and to assume the appearance of grassroots groups, to tell you nuclear power is green, to tell you that don't listen to the labor activists because they're overpaid, or they're lying, or they're stealing money, just like Burger King did against the coalition of Immokalee workers. Their PR firm Edelman managed a major smear campaign that involved both online and offline contacts with general sort of audiences as well as journalists against them. Not to mention, of course, the propaganda in the lead up to the war, and the among many other tactics, using the Pentagon pundits, the dozens of Pentagon retired military officers who went on cable news night after night and are still on cable news, and actually NPR, and many other places, selling the war. And even though they had their own concerns, not voicing those concerns about the war and the way that it was going, because they wanted that inside access to high-level officials to benefit their military contractor clients. So this is the problem. We know this is a problem. So how do we push back? How do we get a media system that supports democracy, and what does that look like? There are lots of different tactics that have been used. Of course, making our own media, and I would include the Progressive in that, is definitely important. Movement media, talking amongst ourselves, making sure that the untold stories get out there, talking about analysis. I want to share, just because it's Wisconsin specific, and I think it's very interesting. Meta Berger, who's a Milwaukee woman in the early 20th century. She was actually the first woman elected to head a school board in Milwaukee in the U.S. And she, along with her husband Victor Berger, who was the first socialist elected to Congress, she's got this autobiography that I would highly recommend. It's from Wisconsin Historical Society Press, talking about, among other things, to support Milwaukee's socialist mayor, how they struggled to put out a socialist newspaper, and what did they do that, and why did they do that, and the fact that they were getting information from Europe, and how Europe was crafting these policies, and how it was impacting the lives of the people there, and no one else was going to publish that. So they scrimped, and they worked really hard. They organized people, to their friends, to go out and buy products from the advertisers in their paper, and then they would save the receipts and they would bring them back to the advertisers to make sure that they were going to buy more ads in the paper. So it's an interesting sort of view into, these struggles have been going on for a long time, and need to continue. We watchdog media, we work to cultivate, good reporters within the mainstream media, demand fair representation within mainstream media of the diversity of our communities, and we push for policies that, in support of greater media diversity and media that's more accountable to communities. So these are all things that we've been doing for, not just decades, but almost centuries. So what's new today, and what's the opening? And what I hope is an opening, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, is much like the rest of the economy, but even worse than the rest of the economy, the news media, mainstream media economic model is collapsing. It's in crisis, we all know this. The most recent State of the News Media report out from the Project for Excellence in Journalism sort of lays out some really sobering information about how badly it's going for news media. Nearly 1 out of 5 journalists who were working for newspapers in 2001 are now gone. They're 20% of the workforce is gone, and there's been thousands more jobs cut just since 2009 started. Half of the states, in the time when we have massive stimulus funds, coming from the federal government, all sorts of important decisions being made, half of the states don't have any reporters in Washington, D.C. They don't have that coverage. They're not being able to serve as a check on the power of their local elected representatives. Local television news, which remains the #1 source for information for people in the U.S., they're being slashed. Their revenue was down in an election year last year, which is the first time that's ever happened. TV networks weren't hit as hard, but for example, there's no TV network with a person reporting in Iraq at this point. Ethnic media had a mixed picture where, because we had a historic presidential election in terms of race, a lot of these are small organizations, so they had more sort of interest and more visibility than traditionally they have had, but you had a lot of ethnic print publications that are moving online and just don't have the resources to continue to print, as is true with a lot of other print publications. So, as I started off, downsized newsrooms are obviously bad for democracy. When we're dealing with financial crisis, what you're going to have, when you have downsized newsrooms, you have more of an ability for spinners to come in and not just spin what's being reported, but to actually serve as the reporters, to pass off marketing and PR content as news and to have it sometimes wholly represented, whether it's in a TV or radio broadcast or online or on the printed page. And you have publications, trade publications like PR Week saying, the good news is that that entertainment news is economy proof. So, don't worry, you'll still have Paris Hilton updates. But my hope at least is that this collapse actually provides a little bit of an opening to push for more responsive, more democratic, and more supporting of democracy media system. So right now we have a situation where there's a lot of concern, especially in newsrooms, about the future of newsrooms, but the people who are dominating the conversation about what happens next are the people who got us to this place. And it's just like with the Wall Street bailout. You don't want these people to be in charge. You don't want these people to be making the decisions. We need to have voices in there. And I think that we have a long history of the watchdogging and the challenging and building our own media, and we have a lot of experience to go out there and to say, look, any sort of rebuilding of the media system has to include, X, Y, and Z. And I would say, we need to make sure that as the media system rebuilds, and I think there's going to be several models out there for how it gets rebuilt, that we need to say, no more media consolidation, because as it has been a demand for for decades, there needs to be more media consolidation. Whatever corporate media says is the problem, the answer is always more consolidation. We need to make sure that that's not going to happen. We need to break up the monopolies that we already have in media companies, make sure that there are more public interest obligations and that they're actually enforced, requiring community access and input. So to bring it back to the communication rights idea and to think about in your work, whatever issue you work on, what does a real communication rights framework look like reporting on that issue? What would it be? Would it be making sure that your voices are in reports on whatever issue, making sure that there's a wide cross-section of the community that has access and that's represented in news reporting, making sure the editorial process is more transparent and responsive to community input, and just making sure that, again, you're not seeing print press releases or whatever being marketing and PR materials being passed off to news audiences as news.
What is that look?
I'm done.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, it's my turn. I can't follow that. That was pretty good. That's pretty good. Listen, because we're a small group and I want us to get to some questions, and it's been interesting when Ben first emailed me and Matt said gave us this title, Expanding Democracy, my first question was, well, what are we talking about? And for what you covered, that was really, really good, although I can't say that I had any kind of sympathy for any big company collapsing, because it's not like we're represented anyway. And when you talk about whether or not there are any reporters covering the war in Iraq, well, when they were there, they weren't covering it. They were embedded. What they were covering, what they were told to cover. So, good riddance. On with the new. So I want to talk about something else a little different, and then we'll come back to some of the other stuff because I think it all kind of goes together. And I mentioned it earlier in the earlier discussion on the criminal industrial complex as to, and I think it kind of ties into my understanding of democracy and expanding democracy, although when you're in a minority, democracy isn't necessarily a good thing. You're always going to, you're always going to be the minority. Yeah, it's not like you can outvote them. So, and when you talk about democracy from the perspective of people that have been traditionally locked out, well, you're starting at a deficit. And so when you talk about expanding, you just get me up even, and then let's talk about expanding. So, and so for me, I said that the politics for the community that I come from have always been about the politics of self-defense, which means that you're really mitigating the negative impact of government, of business, of policies, of predatory structures. So it's not necessarily about democracy, it's about protection, it's about responding. Even if we talk about expanding democracy in the face of an increase in participation by black elected officials, so then you have black faces basically doing what the white faces were doing, so there's no real change in the kind of punishments or the kind of penalties or the kind of structural inequities, but the direction of cash flow, you just got a group of black folk or brown folk or whatever folk managing your oppression. So what are we talking about? So I want to talk about some solutions, or not necessarily solutions, because it's not like I'm the answer man, but I want to talk about what it is that we have to put in place locally to support some of the things that you've been talking about and that you've been talking about. What are the new structures that we have to start considering, even in the realm of the new media in local communities? I come from a tradition of, I've edited several black newspapers in South Carolina over the course of the last 20 years. And I've seen them when they were at their height, when they were really informing the community and making the power analysis between the folk on the top and those on the bottom, when it validated people's existence, when it validated their accomplishments, to now where they're just sheets that advertise liquor and tobacco, and they might argue with that, we've got a voice, but are you an effective voice? But there's some things that need to be put in place that we have to start talking about in a functional way. And I mentioned it earlier in the earlier session about the idea of freedom schools and what they do to educate the community. This idea of having independent structures within the community that educate folk on the issues that we support, that educate politicians on the issues that we support, that mobilize people around the issues that we support, that are multi-purpose organizations that can file lawsuits on our behalf, that can put people in the streets on our behalf, that can support politicians that take a particular view, that replace, in some cases, or have an auxiliary, and maybe it's a propagandist mechanism, But it's the whole idea of perhaps even the community-based radio stations once again, such as with the Prometheus Project and what they're doing, and the low wattage stations, to make sure that we're putting out our own word, that we're not depending on, A, raising the resources to fight the corporate battle to break up the monopolies. If we can raise the resources to get people to a meeting, that's usually a good thing. I mean, I wish we could have raised the resources to get more people of color to this meeting, because this is an important meeting, so that they can go back. I mean, now I'm going to go back and do what I got to do, but those are the kinds of things that we have to do to extend or expand democracy. And realizing that we have to rebuild the coalitions that were once in place. And I mentioned it earlier, as in my history and in my experience as a black organizer in the South, I realized that the resources for fighting who I was fighting in the South wasn't going to come from where I was. And that we had to have organizations and people that were independent of those communities to some degree for their livelihood in order for them to survive. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at recreating, re-putting in place, because at one time they did exist, you know, to some extent, to expand democracy, to change the how we think about the issues, not necessarily to, even if we have more democracy, which to some people mean you have black faces or brown faces or red faces, whatever kind of faces, but on the television screen that basically say the same thing, or that the man would say. And they call that diversity. It's not necessarily diversity of ideology, it's just different colors of people. That's how diversity is defined these days, just to have an array of different people of different sexual orientations or different genders or different colors, but there's not necessarily any diversity of opinion. So that the left, in an American context, is, as we talked on the phone, Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid. It's not us. Or when you look at talk about the war. Now the mainstream media is going back and rereading everything that the opposition to the war wrote prior to the war and regurgitating it like it's new news, like we weren't torturing people, like the country never had a history of torturing people. See, if we had a diversity of views in the first place, then someone would have said, hey, Abu Ghraib, well, you might need to go over to this prison and see how they conduct their business. Or as someone mentioned the other day, waterboarding and torture. Well, what about the restraint seats? Or what about solitary confinement? So, as I said, let's for me, I want to talk about in this discussion, as a part of this discussion, building the new movement and putting some structures in place to really create some grassroots efforts on the ground, and not wasting a whole lot of resources, and because I don't want to say anything that, because sometimes I run off at the mouth sometimes, you got to forgive me. But you know, as I said, you're not gonna, I think it's gonna be very difficult to reform the corporate media. As I said, we do have to be watchdogs and we do have to be a counter to them, but we have to be independent of them, and we have to build something separate from them. And then this idea of democracy, and we can talk about it a little bit more. I said, I'm still, you know, when we started on this subject and we've been talking about this, and for the last couple of weeks I've cut my grass and I've thought about it. I write something down. I talk to family members. Well, you know, but I just think that we're at a point in history, and it is a good point in history, that we have the opportunity to build. Mm-hmm. And we have the opportunity to educate people on a different ideological perspective. And that different ideological perspective, and let's just call it what it is socialism. And I don't know why we're all dancing around that term. It's socialism. It's building a new economic structure. We always knew that capitalism was about exploitation and about fraud to a larger degree, and making sure that people were ignorant to buy whatever it was that they created to exploit you with. So let's talk about how do we help. I'm trying to avoid the word propagandize, but how do we help re-educate people as to how they need to think about our society, think about our relationships with one another, think about our economy, think about our relationship with the world, think about what participatory democracy is, expand what they think about democracy. Democracy isn't necessarily just running somebody for office as a Democrat or Republican. It's about fusion politics. It's about third-party politics. And being able to talk about that and build those kinds of structures at the local level. And because that's the next direction for our movement, I would think, and that's the next direction for American politics, a broader multi-party system, a broader coalition-based system. That's what I believe is the next move in our movement, and that's what I think expanding democracy is about. It means even in the face of having a popular president, that we don't lose focus as to, or at least for me, as to support of a broader third-party movement or multi-party movement, and recognizing the impediments to that and educating people on that and having them act on that. And obviously, the easiest place for them to act on that is at the grassroots level. We look at this current president and, Justice Department, appoints Eric Holder as the first black head of the Justice Department. Everybody says, that's great. But I go all the way back to Lonnie Guinier, which, when you want to talk about structural change and multiple and cumulative politics and cumulative voting, that is a more fair representative way of electing and choosing representation. Then that, to me, is structural change that matters. That, to me, is expanding democracy. Beyond that, an Eric Holder is status quo. It's going to be the same old thing. So in that, I'm done. We open it up for questions, I assume. Yep. How's that?